The Spiritual Scientist podcast is today joined by Matt Segall, who is the Assistant Professor of Philosophy, Cosmology and Consciousness at, I didn't write down. Whereabouts is it, Matt? Can you just remind me?
Sure, it's California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco.
Okay, wonderful. Sounds like a really great range of topics to be teaching.
Yeah.
And Matt is the author of a forthcoming book, which is about to be published very soon, from what I'm told, called Crossing the Threshold. And I was really excited and interested to have Matt join the show today because Matt's someone who's very well versed in philosophy, but also has a good grounding in anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner's work as well, which is mostly what we talk about here. So very happy to have you here today, Matt. Welcome.
Yeah, glad to be here, Mick. Excited to talk to you about philosophy and Steiner's relationship to the history of philosophy and all of that. So curious to see where we will go today.
Yeah, me too. Great. So, my big question really was that, well, there was a couple, but the big one that was in the back of my mind when I first saw some of your videos and heard you speak was to ask you about where Steiner and his philosophy fits into the history of philosophy, as it were, because I always had trouble sort of working out, is he, because he does speak about coming out of German idealism, or he talks about German idealism quite a bit. But yeah, I'd really love to get your take on where he fits in some degree.
Yeah. Well, it's a big question. And in some sense, Steiner tells us where he thinks anthroposophy fits in the history of philosophy in his book, Riddles of Philosophy, where, he goes all the way back to beginning with Pherecydes in ancient Greece through to the German idealists and 19th century materialist philosophy, and then shows how this whole development or evolution of consciousness, as it were, through the cultivation of a particular form of thinking activity, culminates in a kind of crisis that can only be overcome by developing a kind of clairvoyance through intuitive thinking, right? And that's what leads into anthroposophy. And so for Steiner, I think the German idealists, as you mentioned, are especially important. And there are many reasons for that, but the important context to remember here, and I don't think I'm the only one who feels this way, but what was accomplished by thinkers like Kant and especially Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, and even though he wasn't so much a philosopher, we have to throw Goethe in there as well. What was accomplished by these figures, at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, was on a par with what was accomplished by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in ancient Athens. The temperature, as it were, of thought was raised to such a high level that certain habits of thought were just melted away to make room for a new kind of consciousness to be born. And the tragic thing about German idealism is that after these figures died, Hegel died in 1831, Schelling died about a decade and a half later, their thought, actually almost 2 decades later, their thought was kind of covered over by the rising tide of materialism and positivism, and an approach to science that was just fully mechanistic. And so the organic understanding of nature and the spiritual potential of human thinking that these philosophers had tried to develop and cultivate was just sort of put in cold storage. And there is more interest in their thought nowadays, though it's not, there's a lot of inconsistency in the way that it is taken up and mobilized for different purposes, whether it's in political theory or environmental studies or in philosophy proper. And I think Steiner represents a really unique way of inheriting the German idealist um, movement of thought, but also really carrying it forward beyond what any of these thinkers were able to do themselves. And we can talk more about what exactly Steiner is doing to carry it forward. It's a very interesting subject to try to unpack. But let me pause there and just see
Mhm.
if any questions or concerns or confusions arise so far.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure where to go. It's there's so many different directions. I mean, the question you just came to though, how did Steiner carry it forward? You know, what was it that he was carrying forward? And maybe a little bit more about what was this barrier that was reached? Um, what was that barrier and how was it moved past in a way?
Yeah. So the usual history of the philosophical period known as German idealism is said to climax with Hegel, even though Schelling outlives Hegel by a couple decades and articulates the first, I think, important criticisms of Hegel that were influential for Steiner. Nonetheless, Hegel is thought of as the climax because of the way that he followed the logic of thinking, a kind of sense-bound thinking still, through to the end, and arrived at what he called the absolute idea or absolute knowledge, which Steiner himself says, and I forget which lecture, but that basically when Hegel was articulating his logic, which is a sort of dialectical logic, right? That's a um, very much an understanding of logic as a process of development, much like, and in fact, explicitly, Hegel connects this to the way that Goethe understands the metamorphosis of plants and organic forms generally. Hegel's logic, Steiner says, it's as though Hegel wrestled free from Ahriman the this intellectual power of abstraction so as to win it for human use, and that it's very important that human beings gain a sort of mastery over this ability lest they be mastered by it. And so, esoterically speaking, this is what Steiner's view of Hegel's accomplishment is. However, the limitation here is that Hegel did not cultivate or did not naturally possess, in the way that some people, including Steiner, seem to, this clairvoyant capacity to really perceive the spiritual world, to perceive the etheric dimension of nature in a way that Goethe could, let's say. And Goethe famously regretted the fact that he couldn't understand the conceptual gymnastics of a lot of these philosophers, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, but Goethe had this inborn capacity to perceive the etheric, right? Hegel didn't have that so much, and so he sort of leaves us with just the concept, and Steiner is able to push beyond this conceptual logic by emphasizing the role of intuitive thinking that individuals must cultivate, so that we go beyond just the general concept into the process of fashioning our own mental pictures and coming to our own individual perception of the spiritual world and participation in the spiritual world. And the fruits of that sort of intuitive thinking or clairvoyant capacity or participatory thinking, I think, are borne out in the ways that Steiner initiates all these different practical initiatives that are applying these insights to everything from farming to education to pharmaceutical medicines and so on. So there's a practical application, and in the idealist philosophers, there's very little practical application. It remains at the level of conceptual abstraction. So while Steiner is he has lots of praise for Hegel, for Schelling, probably a bit more for Schelling than Hegel, but it all depends on the context. He nonetheless feels like they came up short and that we need to go beyond them, but we need to go through them to go beyond them. Steiner also says that Hegel sort of typifies the consciousness soul, right? And this he and so if we want to be appropriate for our time and our phase of the evolution of the human spirit, we really do need to understand Hegel, even if we need to continue onwards. It's not as though we can bypass his accomplishment.
Okay, so we need to understand Hegel. That's a big ask, because if you have ever opened a book by Hegel, it's not the simplest thing to understand. I read something recently just on Hegel that another philosophy person was saying that he tends to be understood incorrectly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but it tends to be, people tend to read him as if he's writing in kind of finished thoughts, and in a way what he's doing actually is walking you through a process. He's taking you through an experience, actually, an experience in thinking, an experience in conceptual thinking, possibly as well. But rather than he's saying this is my philosophy and it's the finished product, he's walking you through a process. Is that fair to say? And is that one of the big misunderstandings with Hegel's work?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And it is, I mean, in particular, his book, his first major work, The Phenomenology of Spirit, is written as, and he's explicit about this, as a kind of preparation for understanding the logic that he will later develop. And it's in this way a kind of initiatory journey through shapes of consciousness, which you might understand historically as the sort of steps that the human being has gone through in an attempt to know the world and itself. Though it's not exactly historical, it's a bit more abstract than that. It's not like you could just trace through the history of philosophy in the way that, say, Steiner does in Riddles of Philosophy, which is, I think, more concrete. And part of the reason for the abstract nature of the Phenomenology of Spirit is that Hegel wrote it under some duress. He was broke at the time. The publisher he was working with wasn't making his payments on time, and when he was just finishing the final part of the phenomenology, Napoleon's army invaded Jena. And so he's like rushing to finish the final chapters while he hears cannon fire echoing outside of his home, and sent the manuscript actually across Jena just as the army was reaching the gates of Jena. I wasn't sure if it was going to reach the publisher. So we're actually quite lucky to even have a copy of this text. So if you can forgive Hegel for its obscurity because of the conditions under which he was writing it, perhaps, but it is very much supposed to be read as an initiatory, an invitation to initiation, let's say. And he wants to guide you through a process of metamorphosis through different, what he calls shapes of consciousness, and show how these different stances that the human mind can take towards the world and towards knowledge of objects, that they tend to arrive at contradictions, but rather than these contradictions stymieing our efforts, they actually transform and are overcome and give rise to yet higher shapes of consciousness. And so his famous dialectic is, in a way, the method or the logic that comes out of this experience of moving through shapes of consciousness in an attempt to know the world, and reaching a dead end where you just feel blocked because of paradoxes and contradictions. But through persisting in the tension of the contradiction, the contradiction itself is negated and a new synthesis arises that gives you a totally new view of the problem, and you continue on in a sort of spiral towards what he calls absolute knowledge, which is the culmination, the climax at the end of this work, the phenomenology of spirit. And so you can't really read it as a series of arguments.
Mm.
It's really a description of a journey through the metamorphosis of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Well, lots to unpack in there, but yeah. Okay. So, in a sense, the Hegel and others they broke through something. They broke through what was it they broke through in a way? I mean, I keep thinking for some reason I always think back to Hume
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of impasse that was set up there, where Hume, I've heard people say Hume's their favorite atheist because he sort of took it all to its logical conclusion. In a sense, he takes the materialism, or not that he was he was writing sort of before all that took off, but he was taking logical thinking to its logical conclusion, and there was a difficult to move past that, with the ought is thing.
Mm-hmm.
um
Mm-hmm.
and then it feels like what happened after that, you know a lot more about this than me, but what happened after that is that um there I mean, where I don't get where they went from there. How did people move past that? It was either we revert back to old school religion and we just have to have faith,
Mm-hmm.
or we push forward into something else. I'm not quite sure where I'm going, but I don't know if you can help me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the good news about Hume is he's such a skeptic that I think his position's probably better stated as a kind of agnosticism. He just would say we can't know
Mm-hmm.
these questions, that reason has limits. It's limited by the nature of our sense perceptions. And for Hume, all of our concepts are just faded impressions that came through the senses, right? And so he has a very um, dead conception of thought. Like in Hume, thinking is basically just dead perceptions that have been congealed in the mind, and when the sense impressions come into the mind, we can abstract away, analyze different parts of what we perceive, say separate the color from the shape and rearrange them, and through fantasies come up with ideas that we never experience in the world, but they're made of parts that we did experience in the world, right? But there's no real creative thinking. There's no um, world of concepts that we would be drawing upon to interpret our perceptual experience. For Hume, that's a delusion of dogmatic metaphysics, you would say. But the starting point for Hegel, for Schelling, for Fichte is really Kant. But Hume, it's important that you mention Hume, because Kant famously says of David Hume that upon reading, I think Hume's Inquiry into Human Understanding, that Kant was awakened from his dogmatic slumber, his words,
Mm.
by which he means Hume shook him awake out of this dream that the dogmatic metaphysicians had, that the human mind has a sort of unproblematic relationship to the objects that it attempts to know. And Kant took Hume's critique of metaphysics and the possibility of knowing the world with certainty very seriously, but tries to circumvent Hume by developing a whole new method of philosophy. Kant calls it transcendental idealism. And what Kant ends up doing, just to put it very simply, is rather than thinking that the objects that the mind is trying to know, that the mind comes to know those objects by conforming to the structure of those objects, which are just sort of out there waiting for us to know them, Kant reverses this picture and says that, well, actually, the objects must conform to our own subjective way of knowing them. And this is what transcendental philosophy really refers to, that really the activity of our own subjective mental process is a priori, which is his word, which means it comes prior to our experience of the world, and that our ability to perceive and think about objects is only a result of the organization of our mind, right? So we're not just a blank slate waiting for impressions from the world. We arrive at our perceptual encounter with objects already active, forming the structure of those objects, and even space and time themselves. For Kant, they're not out there. We don't come to learn about them through our perception. The mind and our sensory organization provides space and time as what he calls forms of intuition. And so the takeaway here is that the world must conform to our way of knowing it. We don't know about any world independent of our way of knowing it. And so if we can understand our own organ of knowing, if we can undertake a critique, Kant would say, of our own understanding, then we can come to secure knowledge upon that basis. Now, this leaves us in a problematic situation because, of course, Kant would admit, well, there is a realm of things in themselves beyond our mind and our senses and our way of organizing our experience, but we can't know anything about that. It's the realm of noumena, very mysterious, but we just have to mark it with a mere X, like an algebraic variable. We know it exists, but we can't know anything else about it. Kant leaves us in this situation.
We can't really know anything about anything. We can't really. He's saying, is he saying that? So there is a real, that there are things that are real out there, like the table in front of me, the trees out the window. They are real and they're there, but my way of knowing them is all I can know.
Right. And it sounds a lot like what Hume was suggesting, but the difference with Kant is that Kant was trying to secure the possibility for physical science, natural science. And so Kant would say we can still have knowledge of the laws of physics if we grant that this knowledge is knowledge of a realm of phenomena. So nature as it appears to us, we can determine and know according to certain laws. And while Newton might think he was discovering those laws in nature, Kant would say, well, you're really discovering the laws of your own understanding, which are determining in advance how nature can appear to you. But for all intents and purposes, we can continue to do natural science in this way, as long as we accept that our study of nature is merely nature as it appears to our mind. And whatever might be beyond nature, we're not equipped to know, right? There's limits to knowledge.
Okay. So there's limits. So was Hume saying we can't know anything ever, even
Hume was saying that our knowledge of nature is not really lawful or necessary, that it was more that is just purely empirical associations between events, and we can say this causes that because it has occurred repeatedly in the past, but we really have no basis for what's called induction to say that it will definitely, of necessity, happen in the future.
Okay, so that, like, is that the best, the good example of that is that the sun coming up tomorrow?
Yeah.
Can you just say how can you just explain that for us, the induction, how to use that?
Yeah. So there are these two different ways of coming to knowledge. Induction is more of the empirical method where you make an observation of a particular event and you generalize from that particular event to say that, okay, something like this will happen again in the future. Deduction is more of a logical procedure where you're dealing with truths that can be arrived at independent of any experience, and you can move from a general truth and derive more specific or particular truths from it. So this is how syllogistic logic works, and it's in the philosophical tradition that Hume and Kant were working in. Deduction would have to do with analytic truths. And so you're just dealing with concepts. Like if you know that someone is a human being, you also know that they're mortal, because mortality and human being are analytically related concepts. There's a syllogism there that lets you know for sure that if someone is a human being, they're mortal. And induction is more about getting new knowledge um, that's not already sort of hidden within a concept that you have. You actually have to go out in the world and look.
Okay. Right.
And so what Hume was saying is basically that if the scientific method is based on empirical observation, and then we attempt to derive laws based on empirical observation, we have no basis, Hume would say, for claiming that this sort of law we've observed working at this place and time will also work necessarily and universally in other places and times. Whereas to take like Newton's law of gravitation, universal gravitation, seriously, you do need to suppose that this is how nature works everywhere and always. And the way that Kant is able to say that Newton's law of gravitation is still necessary and universal, that it still has some that it still rests upon some necessary law operating in nature, is that he's saying it's describing the way that space and time appear to us because of our sensory organization. And so because of how mathematics, arithmetic, and geometry are a function of our own sensory organization, we can know how objects in space will behave in advance of any experience, because we're only talking about a form of our own intuition. Space is a form of our own intuition, Kant would say, right? And geometry gives us a priori knowledge of all space, because space is, as it were, something we carry around with us. It's not something we have to go out and find. Right? So Hume and Kant have a lot that is similar, in that they limit knowledge, but Kant's way of limiting knowledge is a bit more sophisticated than Hume's, and Kant still wanted to preserve the possibility of at least physical science, though interestingly enough, Kant didn't think we could have a true science of biology, because organisms, living organisms, and in Steiner's terms, anything with an etheric body, and certainly an astral body, can't be predicted with the same kind of laws that apply to the mineral or the physical world, where mechanics is more applicable. But Kant certainly also thought we could have no knowledge of a spiritual world. He didn't deny that there was a spiritual world, but he just said, give up trying to know anything about it. The most we can know about the spiritual world comes through what he thought of as the moral world order, the moral law, the sense of conscience that we experience is as close as we could get to the spiritual world from Kant's point of view.
Okay. Yeah. This is so good. This is great. This is what I've always wanted, is just a philosophy class, but I've never taken one. So good.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we need to get back to Hegel and the German idealists. From how do we get to them out of Kant? Is that possible to make that jump?
Yeah. So the jump happens with Fichte, very important figure for Steiner as well. So Fichte was really just enamored with Kant's philosophy and wanted to overcome what he felt were some mistakes that Kant had made. He, in Fichte's own words, he wanted to remain truer to the spirit of Kant than Kant himself was, because in the letter of Kant, Fichte felt there were certain contradictions that needed to be overcome. And I've already touched on what this problem is, and it has to do with Kant's dualism, really, between a realm of phenomena, which we can know about, and this realm beyond our phenomenal experience, the realm of noumena, or things in themselves that we can't know anything about. The problem is Kant says that at one point in his major work, The Critique of Pure Reason, that our sensory experience is caused by this realm of things in themselves. And so Kant would say we can't really know the ground of our own sensory experience. It's beyond the categories of understanding that we have, because those categories, including causality, only apply to the realm of phenomena that is birthed out of our sense experience. But what is causing our sense experience, Kant says we can't know that. We don't have the categories which would apply to such a realm of things in themselves. But if you haven't noticed it yet, there's a contradiction here, because he's applying a category, causality, which according to his own rules should only apply to the phenomenal realm. He's applying it to the noumenal realm by saying that it causes our sense experience, right?
Okay, right.
Fichte picks up on this and says, because you have to admit this boundary between the real world and the world as it appears to us is a fictitious boundary. And we can do away with the realm of things in themselves. There is only, Fichte would say, the activity of our own mind and consciousness. And so Fichte, from this basic insight, elaborates a form of idealism, which he would say is the truly transcendental form. Kant didn't quite get there. But Fichte ends up having to say that the entirety of nature is, as it were, a product of the mind. And he's been wrongly accused of being a kind of solipsist for this reason. His philosophy is way more sophisticated than any simple solipsism, because Fichte ends up saying that while the world as it appears to any individual mind is in a sense a construct of the activity of that mind, we can only become conscious of ourselves as individuals, Fichte would say, by meeting other self-conscious beings in this world of appearances, right? So there's more than one human being in the world, right? And for each of us to be self-conscious, Fichte would say, we need one another. We need to meet and encounter one another in order to develop a sense of being summoned to our own consciousness. Like, I can't be, as Martin Luther King Jr. put it, it's a very Fichtean insight. I can't be who I am supposed to be until you are who you are supposed to be. And you can't be who you are supposed to be until I am who I am supposed to be. Fichte says this much more simply. No you, no I, no you, right? And so there's a real intersubjective ground to what he's talking about here. And in some sense, when he says that all of the world spills out of the activity of the thinking I, he doesn't mean the little ego in me that I might think I am, or the little ego in you that you might think you are before you've cultivated intuitive thinking capacity. He's talking about a transcendental self that in some ways everyone in the human community is participating in. It individuates in each of us, but we need each other in order to become conscious of it. And so the implications of Fichte's philosophy are rather profound, and in some sense, there's a danger here in the imbalance of this insight. He's so emphasizing the activity of the I that the natural world becomes nothing but a kind of raw material awaiting the freedom of human beings to shape it and to turn it into a kind of stage for the expression of our own freedom, right? And so he would say, for us to know nature, we have to transform it into ourselves. And if that sort of a message is heard in the context of a rather materialistic culture, you can guess where this would go. Industrialization and the increasing advances in technological in technology have in some ways allowed human beings, in a search for greater freedom, but freedom in a more materialistic sense, we've remade the entire planet in our own image. And so there are some dangers to the Fichtean point of view. And this is where Schelling, who was a student of Fichte's, brings more balance to this perspective by saying, hey, wait a minute, is also uh, nature also has some agency here. And he means nature not in a materialistic sense, but nature as an organism. And so Schelling in some ways inverts this whole picture, not to deny the importance of the thinking activity of the free I, but to say that this I is really the hidden potential of nature come to self-consciousness. And so we are an expression of nature. Our consciousness, Schelling would say, is an expression of nature. And here he was influenced quite profoundly, Schelling was, by Goethe and the importance of learning from a deep and intimate observation of the natural world, particularly the living world. And so Schelling develops a whole new form of natural science that's not based in mechanics, but that's based in organics, you could say, in organic process and metamorphosis and so on. And so Schelling tries to balance this Fichtean point of view that so heavily emphasizes the I with a sense of the creativity of nature. And Hegel, you could say, is the attempt to synthesize these two points of view.
Okay. Right.
Yeah, a lot there.
Yeah, it's a lot there. I'm just my mind's just trying to catch up. Crank up as well.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, where do we go from here, Matt? That's a lot for me to take in personally. I don't know about the viewers, but so okay, we've come to some thoughts of Schelling, where and what you said about Hegel trying to synthesize those two views. Where does Steiner come into that, or where does he come out of that? So I mean, some of the things you said about Fichte made me think of Rudolf Steiner in terms of the consciousness of the individual and how it's actually coming into contact with another human being that we sort of awakens our true individuality in a way. And then, so how do we get to Steiner from there, or his thought? I mean, it's we're kind of talking about this stuff in terms of philosophy itself, and Steiner, he was a philosopher, but he did, as you say, his thinking led to so many practical things, whereas the German idealists, it wasn't so practical. So I'm kind of interested in how did it get to that point? And another question that's coming up in there, maybe I should hold off on that one, but just to say it out loud, that with philosophy itself and Steiner's philosophy, it's not in a similar way to Hegel. Perhaps it's not a fixed form of, this is the argument and this the argument, and that works against this in this way, in this logical format. It's really about developing something within yourself, going through a process yourself in order to enhance your consciousness, but to enhance your consciousness not just for your own good and for your own egotistical aims, but rather to enhance your consciousness so that you can be more yourself, more truly who you are, and bring into the world what you're meant to bring into the world, or what you can bring into the world. I don't know if any of that made any sense whatsoever, but if you can find a thread in there for me, I'd be very grateful.
So there's a great book. It's someone's dissertation, actually, that I want to plug, that does some of this work for us in connecting the idealists to Steiner. It was written by Jonale Schickler, who I believe was Swedish by birth, but he studied philosophy in the UK. Gosh, was it Cambridge or Oxford? I'm not sure which, but he wrote a dissertation called Metaphysics as Christology, subtitled Odyssey of the Self from Kant and Hegel to Steiner. And tragically, just literally after finishing just after finishing this dissertation, he died in a railway accident,
Oh.
25 years old. But in this dissertation, which clearly was at least a major part of his karmic task before leaving this incarnation, he goes through Kant's philosophy and Hegel's response to Kant's philosophy quite brilliantly, and not too many pages. It's a wonderful summary, and it's quite a good introduction actually to Kant and Hegel. But he shows how and why Hegel came up short, and he really zeroes in on the importance of the etheric dimension of nature and of etheric thinking, which is what Hegel lacked, that Steiner and Goethe already had begun to cultivate, and that Steiner really leverages to go beyond Hegel. But the Christology part of this here is very interesting, because I think it really does speak to the incarnational vector in so much of Steiner's work and in anthroposophy more generally, to bring the ideas, the ideal and the spiritual into the world, and to make what could otherwise remain theoretical quite concrete and practical. And so what Schickler ends up arguing is that in order to take what Steiner is saying seriously about clairvoyance and etheric thinking, we also need to take seriously the possibility of resurrection. And he says, and I'll summarize a quite deep and profound argument he makes, that we need to understand the Christ event as the resurrection of a physical body, a human body, though in etheric form, if that makes sense. And so if this is not possible, then nor is clairvoyance or nor is there really any way for us to cross the threshold into spiritual knowledge, because we're just limited by a physical body, which is the full extent of who and what we are, right? And so it really does raise the stakes. And I think what Schickler accomplishes here is a clear articulation of the implications of Steiner's work and what it would mean to go beyond what the German idealists accomplished. And he's showing the import of the Christ event here, and the significance of the way Steiner talks about Christ being in the etheric body of the earth at this point. And so, this is where philosophy obviously meets and needs to transform into anthroposophy, because we're not just talking about ideas anymore. We're talking about, on the one hand, moral deeds, but also higher knowledge that goes beyond this. So another way of thinking about what it means for Kant to say that our knowledge is limited by our sensory experience, and that we can't know the ground of our own sensory experience, is to say that physical bodies can't resurrect, that there is no etheric dimension, right? We're literally, our cognition is limited by our physical senses. And so the thresholds that must be crossed from philosophy into anthroposophy, I think, and this is part of what I argue in my book that's coming out, it really does involve and require the cultivation of etheric perception or etheric thinking in different ways, or etheric imagination, different ways of phrasing it, which would be a form of cognition that's participating in the formative forces that give shape to what appears to the physical senses in the form of the mineral body, whether it's our own body or other bodies, right? And that penetrating into the inner dimension of nature, as it were, or the spiritual dimension of nature, is the task that we're set with at this stage in the evolution of consciousness. And unless we're willing to pursue that earnestly, we'll be stuck. We can't go beyond Hegel. Like, anyone who thinks they're doing philosophy in a way that's more complete and insightful than Hegel's is kidding themselves. Like, you could go back and study Hegel, but there's more to be done that's not just philosophy, right? But that Hegel sort of drops us off at the threshold, right? And then we have to continue forward using other methods.
Okay, wow. So we move out of kind of just conceptual thinking and playing around with ideas in a way. Not that they were just playing around with ideas, but I mean, they're all searching for truth, right? They're all
For
wanting to
sure. And I
find out
should
what
say
the
it's
truth is.
the idea. So there's a certain way of playing with ideas that philosophers can engage in. And it can be fun, but Hegel's not playing. He really does emphasize the labor of the dialectical uh, um, movements that he is engaged in his logic and in the phenomenology. It is a labor. It involves negation. It involves really confronting the like you have to go through a kind of death rebirth process, at least in your thinking life, to grasp what Hegel is trying to do. And so it's quite painful, actually. And Steiner says this too, that Hegel's logic is a training in thinking, and that it's kind of a prerequisite for going beyond into the spiritual world and starting to develop clairvoyance just through our own moral intuition and moral imagination as like the first step. In order to think clearly, it's really important to go through this labor. And Hegel is a great school for this type of thinking activity.
Okay, well, it's a school I haven't actually gone to, so I can't really speak to that. But yeah, okay. Wow, just so much to take in, and I find it difficult to know where to go with the next question, to be honest. But where you've just led us up to this this work, which I wrote down, actually, metaphysics as Christology.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to speak about this a few days after Easter.
Mm-hmm.
That we are coming to a point. It feels to me, actually, just speaking to people such as yourself, but just people in general, that there's just there's a real yearning out there for the truth. And I guess human beings have always had a yearning to find the truth. But I think after what's happened over the last few years and all the, I guess, the culture and the media and everything that we're sort of swimming around in has always leaned towards propaganda and less so towards the truth, and all these different ways that we're misled in our thinking, in particularly. That so many people are really asking, what is the truth? And how do I get to the truth? And it seems like most people sort of come up against a wall at some point. You can dive back into, any philosophy or any kind of thought form that you want to dive into, you can jump into and grab onto, but nothing that a lot of people say to me, nothing they find really gets to the core of it. And it's like this the evolution of consciousness has brought us to this point of no meaning. Essentially nihilism is sort of ruling the day in many ways, and it's sort of like people get to the point of just saying, well, I don't know, I can never know the truth. And there seems to be, there's either the diving headfirst into nihilism, or the reverting to an old religious dogmatism. That seems to me what's mostly occurring. And so, the idea of us all going to Hegel's school and really learning to think in that deep way seems like most people probably aren't going to do that. Most people are going to either go in the New Age direction, go in the nihilism direction, or revert to, the dogmatism of the old forms of religion. Sorry, I've just got to flick my power switch on. I don't know if you can go somewhere with that thought.
Well, there's definitely a pervasive nihilism in our culture at the moment and I think you're exactly right. It either leads people into a sort of aggressive atheism and a sort of just egocentric hedonism, or they regress to a kind of very traditional form of belief-based religious observance, fundamentalism. Um, and we desperately need alternatives to this. And, I think the way that Hegel thinks about truth is certainly relevant here. And right at the very beginning of the phenomenology of spirit, he references Goethe's work on plant metamorphosis and talks about the history of philosophy as if it were a developing plant. And you might think at an earlier stage, when the first leaves emerge on the stem, like, oh, okay, here's the truth. Yes, yes. But then the leaves continue to develop into a bud, and you say, oh, okay, this now is the truth. But then the bud breaks open, and the flower springs forth. Like, oh, okay, now this is obviously the truth. But then the flower wilts and dies and makes way for the fruit. And then, oh, okay, now I can eat this, and this is real truth. But then you have the seeds inside and recognize that this process begins again. And so where is the truth? And Hegel will say, well, the truth is the whole process. And where I think the relevance of the Christ event and the Christ being and the Christ impulse comes in here is that the whole is the truth. But rather than ask what is the truth, the leap here, which is a moral deed, is to recognize that perhaps the truth is not a what but a who, and that this who, as the answer to what is, or rather as the object of or subject rather of truth, has something to do with this death rebirth mystery that is evident in the plant world, right? Where there's this cycle from seed to fruit and back again. And that there's something about this rhythm of life, death, rebirth that is characteristic of the etheric dimension, and that the Christ being is the one who is born, dies, and resurrects. And that in some ways the truth here is a moral deed that allows us to give ourselves over to this process and trust that love is the real force of evolution in the world, and that the love that we can participate in, both that we're giving but also receiving, transcends death. It doesn't mean that the person I think I am in this body lives forever, but it does mean that who each of us is in a deeper sense, when we contact that Christ impulse, or the Christ in me, the Christ in you, that this is the truth that we want, that we're searching for, and that it allows us to further the course of human evolution. And unless, and I'm not attached to the name Christ. I think there are different ways of describing this impulse, and I do believe there's an actual being that we're referring to, but it doesn't. The religion of Christianity is sort of incidental to this being, and so people in different cultural contexts might have different names for this, but I do think that it's the only way to avoid extinction for us to contact this truth, because otherwise nationalism, racism, various other ideologies are going to fragment and separate the human being into a war of all against all, right? And so hopefully there's some clarity in some of that. It's obviously still nascent even in my own understanding, but I think there's something to it that hopefully was conveyed.
Very much so. Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's a good place to sort of wind up. I think you have to head off in a second anyway, but yeah, I would like to be a little bit more well versed in philosophy, that I knew had more direct questions where I could lead you. But I think where we got to is a really important point, and hopefully for listeners as well, that we moved from the conceptual realm right down into the here and now, in a sense, and to speak about this being, which or who rather, is able to unite, because essentially what ideologies do is that they split. And I think the trajectory that most of humanity is on is a splitting. Some people have called it, that the age of ideology is actually over now. We can't just grab onto this ideology or that one and still make the world work as it did in the past, because it's going to lead to, as you say, a kind of a war of all against all, my ideology against yours and everybody else's. And that this being that you refer to, and yes, we don't have to get too hung up on the name. It's like you're a person and you've got different traits and characteristics and history, and yes, you've got a name as well, but you're more than just the name. That being is able to unite, and the force with which it unites, or he unites, is love. And what a wonderful place to come to at the end of a discussion about philosophy. The love of what is it? The love of wisdom.
That's right. Yeah. Didn't plan for us to end there, but it definitely did wrap up nicely. Yeah. So, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about this, Mick. I don't often get the chance to elaborate upon German idealism in this way, in this context. So I am grateful for the chance to do that, and I hope it's of value to your listeners. And there's so much more to unpack. So perhaps we can have a future conversation to begin to do some of that.
I would love that. If you're up to having another chat, that would be really wonderful. I've learned a great deal just from this one chat, so I'd really like to do that again. So thank you very much for your time, Matt. And maybe if you could just want to let listeners know where they can find your work. I know you've got lots of YouTube videos out there and philosophical discussions and some really in-depth stuff, but also I think there is also some things that are easier for beginnerish people like me. Just point us towards where we can find you.
So my blog's probably the best place to go. Footnotes2plato.com. It's numeral 2. And my YouTube channel is also called Footnotes to Plato. And on YouTube, for anyone who likes diagrams, I've tried to create a cartoon version running through the various shapes of consciousness in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which you can find on my YouTube channel. So you can see what I was trying to describe conceptually. A lot of people find that helpful. So
that sounds good. Yeah, I'd like some pictures would be helpful. Some pictures in Hegel's books might have been helpful too. But yeah, okay. Well, thanks very much for your time, Matt. And I'll put all the links in the description so that people can find your work anyway, and your new book, which is going to come out soon. So, but yeah, thanks again very much for your time, and all the best.
Yeah, likewise. Take care, Mick.
Thanks very much for listening to the Spiritual Scientist podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can make a one-time donation via PayPal, or if you'd like to become a member, you can make a recurring donation via Subscribestar. The podcast can be found on all good podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, and Google, and the video format can be found on Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute, Brighteon, and YouTube. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.